Hello class, and welcome to this teaching video about compression. So in this Ableton Live 11 demonstration video, we are going to be looking at a compressor, which is a plugin for mixing and mastering. Now this is going to be easily transferable into other DAWs. In fact, if you're using a different DAW for this class, you will probably have a compressor available as well. So first off, when do you want to utilize compression? Well, I noticed in your creative project, specifically your Ableton Concrete project and your Ableton Synth project, that for several of you during the mixing and mastering phase, you had great variations in your overall sound. That is to say, while you were doing the mixing and mastering using your automation, you may not have noticed that certain sections of your piece were vastly softer or louder than other parts. And so that means when listening back to the piece, it sort of forces the listener to either increase the volume or decrease the volume in order to maintain a good listening level. Now, sometimes it's desirable. In recording for symphonic orchestras, for example, they like to have the full dynamic range of the orchestra, from like the quietest flute or violin solo to the sound of all the orchestra playing together, and they like to have that dynamic range available so that the one mixing only is going to use a little bit of makeup gain so that that soft still stays extremely soft and the loud is maxed out at unity or above. However, in most commercially produced music, that is, music that's made to be listened to over the radio, over Spotify, produced through a digital audio workstation, that's usually not the case. Usually they're going to be looking for a final waveform that is more consistent in its sound output. And again, this is because it's meant to be listened to over radio or devices. So you don't want the listener to have to move their volume up and down. You want sort of a smooth listening experience throughout. That doesn't mean there won't be softer sections or more down-tempo sections. That can still happen. But it might be mixed and mastered in such a way so where it doesn't feel like it's had a big drop in volume, even if it's a softer in terms of its timbres or its busyness. Alright, so compression is going to have two main functions, and here they are. First of all, you might use compression on an individual track, an individual instrument, or even an individual take to reduce variations in the volume between them. What that means is if you have a sound source that has very loud louds and very soft softs, and you just kind of want to bring those in closer together so the softs come up and the louds come down some and it's all closer in the same general range, a compressor on the individual instrument or channel can help you to do that. Then there's the compressor for mastering, and this is when you're doing your final mix of the track. You can use a compressor on your master track to help to just narrow that range, to again make the softs a little louder and the louds a little softer so that it gets in a narrower band instead of being so much up and down. Alright, so that's the general concept of the compressor, and for the rest of it I'm just going to show you within Ableton. So I'll say goodbye from the screen now and go to my screen capture. Alright, I'm now in Ableton Live 11 and I've loaded in two clips that have MIDI audio loaded into it. Now the first thing I should say is that the compressor will work on either a MIDI or an audio track. It certainly helps to be able to see the waveform, but it's not necessary. It can still work on a MIDI region. Okay, so I've selected these two MIDI instrument loops here to play, and let's just hear some of what they sound like before we start applying the compressor. Alright, there we go. So those are the two loops we're working with. So not bad. Of course, they're prepackaged loops, so they sound good. They're in time. But one thing that we might notice about them from an audio production standpoint is there is quite a bit of variation among the region. So let's just listen to the drums, the percussion here. Okay. So when listening to that region, hopefully you notice that there's quite a bit of variation between the soft parts of the groove, these little hi-hats and other percussive toy timbres, versus the sort of hard-hitting bass drum and the dung 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 that's bass timbre that's in there. Okay, so there's this great variation in volume. Now maybe you want that. That's fine. If you want to have sort of these ghost notes that's just more invisibly in there, you can take it and tool the velocity down. You can make it to where those are more invisible, just felt rather than heard. But what would happen if we actually tried to make those more audible, to bring those up so that the whole groove sounds busier as a whole? So this is what we have originally. Okay, again, not bad, not bad. Let's start to add a compressor in though. So again, compressor is what we want to use to help narrow this range so that the softs can become more apparent, more audible. All right, so we're gonna bring in our compressor. This is gonna be in Audio Effects, Dynamics, and then Compressor. And again, you can just drag it into the audio effects or double click it and it will appear. Okay, so here I already had one. I'm just going to delete it so that we can have the one that we just added. Wait. Okay. So we're now looking down here in the audio effects window to see the compressor. Now, when I hit play, you're going to see the audio waveform going through right here in the window. That's going to help us out here. So let's watch it. Okay, and pause it right there. So notice before this goes away, there's quite a bit of difference between the peaks and the valleys of this waveform. The highs are up here, the valleys are sort of down here, and there are these ghost notes in between, right? So we're going to use the compressor to try to correct this. Now the compressor has a few parts which are really important. The first one being the threshold. So the way the threshold works, I'm just going to go ahead and loop this clip to show you, is the threshold is going to say at what decibel level does the compression effect start. So right now at a threshold of 0, it's saying anything over 0 is where the effect is going to begin. So if you look at our waveform right now, we don't really have anything over 0. It's all under. So essentially right now the compressor is doing nothing. So when we set our threshold, we want to have a lower threshold. And this is going to determine how much of the waveform we're catching. So let's just go ahead and show by doing. We're going to start to lower our threshold. And once it's intersected parts of the overall shape here, the more it's intersecting, the more active the compression is. Alright, so see how as I'm lowering the threshold, you hear it getting softer. Until essentially it's down to nothing here. Alright, but what gives, you might be asking? What's the idea of it getting softer? I thought the point was to help us hear things more distinctly. Well, this is actually a sign that the compressor is doing its job, and we'll talk about how you end up hearing things more in just a bit. Okay, so let's look at our ratio. You see 4 to 1. What this means is that once you hit the threshold, which here is minus 64 decibels, then it's going to take 4 decibels of increase in sound to increase 1 decibel after it's been compressed. In other words, this waveform is going to be having to do more work in order to increase a single decibel, 4 decibels to 1 decibel. Alright, so that's the reason why right now the waveform is so small, because it would have to go 4 times more in terms of volume to get up to what it had been before. Whereas if we raise the threshold, now there's no longer as much distance that's being covered by the compressor, so we can hear more of it. It's not being reduced as much. In other words, the compressor is a tool for reducing the overall output of sound by making the parts that jump up above the threshold less. It sort of curbs in your peaks, so they're closer to your valleys. Now, in terms of ratio, you can think of it like this. If you have a lower ratio, let's say 2 to 1, this will be a less aggressive effect. That means it will just be more gradual, the effect. More subtle. So let's say I have a threshold of minus 40 here and a ratio of 2. Well, notice it's not as dramatic as it was just a bit when I had it higher. So if we increase the ratio now to something ridiculous like 10 and then play it, you see now things are really getting squeezed in. Hardly audible at all at 42 to 1. So as a general rule, if you have a higher ratio number to 1, it's going to be a more aggressive effect from the compressor. If you have a lower ratio number, it'll be a more gradual effect. Okay, so again, that's how we narrow our band. The lower your threshold is and the higher your ratio, the more compression you're going to be doing. Again, here is a little ridiculous with this minus 60 threshold and 42:1 ratio. This is going to be kind of the maximum compressor one could do. Like so. So now this raises the question, how does this actually help us? Well, this is because from the compressor you can use makeup gain. So right now we've reduced our gain, or our overall volume, by a lot. It's not really audible, as you can see. So instead we can make up for the gain. Now, one way you can do this is just by turning up the output here in the out, like so. Okay, so there I just manually increased the output by 36 decibels, so that's kind of ridiculous again because we're using a very exaggerated effect at the moment. Or, this is something that I like in Ableton's plugin. Instead of manually setting the makeup output, you can actually just click the function that says makeup. Now, when I do this, this is going to come through rather loud because now what it's going to be doing is it's going to be taking every peak and valley and determining how do we get it back up to a certain threshold, really 0, so unity. So let me hit play and notice how it sounds with the makeup on and the compressor. Alright, so you get the idea. So essentially what it's done is it's now taken that really compressed waveform we made. The lows are brought up and the peaks are brought down, and now we've just moved it all up with this makeup gain. We've said let's move it all up to be near the top, and that's going to help to create sort of a more present signal. It's going to help you hear those inner notes a lot more. Okay, so let's do something a little more reasonable here. Let's do a threshold of 30, minus 30, and a ratio of, let's do 3 to start. All right. We'll have makeup gain checked, and now let's listen to that. So again, what this is saying is once you've passed the minus 30 decibel threshold, it's going to take 3 decibels of increase in order to make 1 decibel of overall increase after going through the compressor. But we've selected the makeup gain, so it's going to normalize this waveform. It's going to move everything up so that it reaches unity. So it makes up for the compressing effect. And the result of that is that the whole groove sounds more present, like it has more body to it. So to prove that, let me toggle it off and on just a bit. So let's start with what we've done. All right, there we go. And again, you could say, well, it just kind of sounds like you've increased the gain, but the compressor is doing more than that. It's helping to bring out those individual little notes, those little clicks as part of the beat, and bring those more to the foreground. So again, this sort of took the overall sound of the waveform and just made it more present all throughout, more consistent, so there wasn't as much up and down in terms of the volume output. All right, but that was all just working with drums, with this drum kit. So let's go and listen to some melody, because this can also work with pitched instruments as well. Now, it tends to work best on instruments that have more variation, so things like percussive waveforms, as opposed to sort of having a consistent, sustained waveform. So let's listen to our little vamp here in the keyboard. All right, so what I like about this vamp is, first of all, the individual hits are rather percussive. They're rather short. Dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun. So what that means is that the waveform after its initial attack is going to drop off quite a bit because it's not being held down. Second thing I like is that there are these echoes, right? The reverb tail that's like dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun, sort of that little echoing tail. But maybe instead of having it fade so much, we want to bring it out more. A compressor can help us to do that, to reduce the variation in this instrument. So let's go ahead and do our settings. It's going to be just like the ones that we were doing before. Turn our compressor on. Now, first I want us to do a setting that's similar to the one that we just had, which was maybe a threshold of 30. We could even do 20 or 25. And let's have a pretty aggressive ratio, like 4:1, with makeup gain, of course. And let's just see how this sounds. All right, so at the end, what I ended up with was minus 40 threshold and a ratio of 9:1, so a little exaggerated of an effect there. But what I was trying to show was that this compressor is now helping that echo tail to come out pretty much as presently as the original hits. Not only that, you're also hearing what happens after the reverb of each attack more presently, because it's taking that softer part of the waveform and it's compressing it first and then bringing it all up. So it's making that more present. So here's it without the compressor. Not really hearing any of the echo, just hearing ba-bum bump short. Now here's with the compressor. So just in general, a little harder hitting all around, and it's bringing up that echo, the reverb tail, a lot more. Okay, so that was using a pretty aggressive compressor setting here, but what if we tried for a more gradual approach? So what this would do is, instead of having a middle-ish threshold like 20 to 30, we're going to set the threshold really low. I'm just going to say minus 60, all right? Minus 60 here, so pretty much nothing. That means almost all of the signal is going to be compressed. Now, if we had a very aggressive ratio for this, that's going to create that block where it's really going to be close to brick wall, where it's very close to unity all the time. So when you use a lower threshold, what you want to do is lower your ratio accordingly. So if you have a higher threshold, you can use a higher ratio. If you have a lower threshold, maybe you want to use a lower ratio, like 2:1. So what this means is, now that it has more room to work with, everything over 60 decibels, which is pretty much the whole signal, you're just going to compress it lightly, 2:1. And as a result, it's going to squeeze everything together a little bit. Technically it's going to halve the peaks and valleys, so make everything twice as close to each other. And then with the makeup, it's going to bring it all up. All right, that's cool. So what will that do? Well, instead of being as dramatic of an effect, it'll just sort of raise the presence of the soft parts of the whole region. So let's go ahead and see what this would sound like as opposed to a more dramatic approach. So that's, again, it's taking a less dramatic approach. It's not, really hitting super hard and clamping down, but it just sort of creates an overall smoother waveform. So again, here's without the compressor at all. And here's with. So we're getting some of that inner echo tail, just not as much as when we did a 30 threshold with a 4:1 ratio. That was more extreme. In general, when you're trying to bring up more specific things, like the inner notes of this drum beat, maybe you want to use a higher ratio with
sort of a middle threshold, -20 or -30. But maybe if you're just trying to sort of make the whole waveform, the whole region more present with less variation dynamically, then use a low ratio like 2 and a low threshold like here -60. And always remember to make sure you have your makeup gain on. Alright, so let's go ahead and play our tracks all together, both of them. And at first I'm going to do it with no compressor at all, so just hear what the original sounded like. And then we're going to add in our compressor and see how that affects the overall feel. So here's no compressor. Alright, got that in your ear? Now here's turning on our compressor. This should help to make some of those drops in energy and volume come up more, so it's all more present, sort of all more in your face. Let's go ahead and hear it. So that's what it sounds like with compression. Now, again, that's a specific effect that you could choose to use in your mixing and in your composition. It doesn't mean you have to use compressor on every single channel. In fact, it might be better for some things, like a drum kit or like voice, which tends to have a lot of variation, than with other instruments, like maybe an electric guitar or a synth piano that are easier to balance. So do consider carefully where you want to use compression. And then the last place to use compression is on your master track when you are doing your overall mix. So maybe you've done your automation, everything is sounding good, but there's just some variation between different parts of the song. I won't really be able to show that so well with this because I really only have one texture. But let's say it starts off softer, and then in your mix later on it's getting louder and sort of mixed at unity, and then it's curbing off again, so getting softer at the end. Well, you can go to your master track, which should always be down here at the bottom of your timeline, master track, and then drag in a compressor for your audio effects. Now, a warning about this. Because it's on your master track, this compressor is going to be affecting everything. So every single track that you have, everything that runs through your DAW is coming out through this master. So if you put a compressor on here, you're saying this is the last step, right, for the mastering stage. You're saying everything that you've mixed is now going through this compressor. Okay, so what do you want to do if you're doing compression for mastering? Generally speaking, this is going to be the approach where you do a low ratio, 2:1 or even less, and then a low threshold. So essentially what you're doing is you're saying, I want to apply it to pretty much all the sound in my project, but I don't want to do it aggressively because I've already done my mix to where I'm sensitive to things, you know, maybe something's a little softer so that the voice can stand out. Maybe the drums come to the fore here so the bass goes down. I don't want to destroy that. Rather, I'm just going to say for the whole project, we're going to compress it just a little bit. 2:1, maybe even 1.5:1, why not? So we're just having a little bit of an effect here. And then turn on your makeup. And again, it's not really going to show it with just these two tracks that don't change, but if you have a whole song that's going through different sections, even just this little bit, applying 1:5, 1.5:1 or 2:1 ratio can have a big impact on your mastering. That's sort of part of the process of creating a final deliverable waveform, the mastering process as opposed to the mixing. Alright, so here's what I've done. I've gone ahead and added in just the melodic vamp at first, and then adding in the drums after. So I'll go ahead and listen to it without the compressor on the master. Okay, here we go. Alright, so what we just heard there is probably a pretty big jump in volume when the drums first came in. However, if we use the compression, we can make that jump less. So again, using these settings of 2:1 with -60 threshold and makeup, let's see if this actually helps to make those elements just gel a little bit better with not as much variation. and there we go. The proof is in the pudding. So I was monitoring the waveform here in the compressor the whole time with the output function turned on, and I noticed that the waveform being outputted was pretty consistent even after we added a whole new layer. So that's the compressor doing what it's supposed to on the master, just helping those elements to gel a little better without big jumps in volume. Once that drum layer came in, it just squeezed it all a little bit and had makeup gain to help it get back to 0. All right, and with that, that's going to be our Ableton Live 11 demonstration video on compression. I do hope this is helpful to you in composing and especially mixing and mastering your final projects. Remember, just as a review for the compression, you can use it as an effect on an individual instrument or track. This usually is going to help that what you've recorded or written or the loop that you're using just kind of sound more present, like have more body all throughout, and those smaller notes or smaller variations or echoes to be more audible. So do consider using compression as a plugin as an effect. Then you can also consider using it at your mastering stage by putting it on the master output and just using a little bit of compression, like 2:1 or less, over the whole waveform. So at like a -60 or -50 threshold. And that way it'll just squeeze everything together a little bit so there's less jumping up and down in your overall master track. And again, if you're trying to go for having very small sections to very big and present sections, feel free to do that. Then in that case, compression is not for you there. But if you're trying to mix a track for radio presentation or to be played at a club, you might want to use some compression so it all gets a little bit closer and more consistent. All right, that's going to do it for this Ableton Live 11 demonstration video, and I will see you in the next one.